Well, as I mentioned, if you've been with us regularly, we've been working our way through the book of Luke. It's a wonderful book. Again, I encourage you to sit down and read it. Read it all through one day. It's a wonderful thing to do. But this is our last sermon in the book of Luke for a little while. And you might think, why are we stopping here? I had that question when Dave set the preaching plan a few months ago, and I got this passage. I thought, why are we stopping here? It's in the middle of a chapter. Why stop at verse 50? If you've got your Bibles there, it's not in a handout, but if you look at the next verse in Luke, in verse 51, we read that as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. See, why are we finishing up in verse 50 today? Because in many ways, we're kind of coming to the end of the first section of Luke. I want to put to you today that actually, I think this is kind of the closing scene of the first part of the trilogy of Luke. What's a trilogy? Well, you know, there's many famous trilogies. The Matrix might be a favourite, maybe Star Wars. My favourite personally is The Lord of the Rings. Love that trilogy. Katie and I have just finished watching The Rings of Power. That might offend you. It offends my friend who is a die-hard Tolkien fan. But we quite enjoyed it. But I love The Lord of the Rings. I love the way that the trilogy, it's one big journey, one big story, but it's broken up into three movements as they journey their way towards destroying the ring. And I was delighted as I've looked at Luke this term to realise, actually, I think Luke, in many ways, is a bit of a trilogy. It's one big story, and there's three big movements through the book. The bit that we've been looking at over the last few weeks is part of kind of the origin story of Jesus. Right, in chapters 1 to 9, Jesus, he's born, he grows up in his hometown, and he spends his time in his home region of Galilee. If you were here a few weeks ago, when we started looking at Luke, we looked at how Jesus preached up in the north in Galilee. The northern parts of Israel, that's where he spends his time travelling around to towns, his hometowns, visiting, preaching. And then after our section today, we read that he sets his face to Jerusalem. And the next chunk of Luke, for about the next 10 chapters, Jesus is journeying to Jerusalem. And he teaches and he preaches. And the narrative, it kind of speeds up. At the first third, it takes 30 odd years. Jesus is born, he grows up. And then it speeds up as he journeys to Jerusalem, to then the climax in the last part of the trilogy, where the final week of Jesus' life in Jerusalem. There he dies, he is resurrected, and he ascends back to the Father. So our passage today, and the final passage of our sermon series today, is the end of this kind of first movement of Luke's Jesus trilogy. It's the end of the origin story of Jesus. It's the end of his time in his hometown in Nazareth around Galilee. And as you had heard it read, and as I read it, you might think it's a bit of a strange place to end. You might actually have thought, well, actually last week would have been a much better ending to this story. Last week, Graham from The Point was here with us, and he shared about the transfiguration on the mountain, right? Jesus is there on the mountain. Moses and Elijah arrive. The voice of God speaks, and Jesus is revealed in glory to be God himself. What a way to end the origin story of Jesus. Here he is, transfigured on the mountain in all his glory. But instead, Luke includes an end to the story that's a bit odd. There's this man who he needs help. There's sickness, there's evil. Jesus almost seems to get a bit frustrated at times. The disciples just don't seem to get, even though Jesus is telling them time and time again that he must die, they just don't get it. And then they start bickering about who's the greatest among them. And then they tell him about this guy who was preaching and healing demons. And then Jesus says, oh, don't stop him. He's one of you. And then it ends. What's all this about? Why would Luke close this section of his story about Jesus in this way? Why not up on the mountain? Why now down in the mountain among the mess of evil useless disciples. See, today we're going to think about, well, why has Luke finished the story like this? But ultimately, we're going to think about, what does this story have to teach us? What does this story have to teach us as disciples of Jesus today? Hopefully we're going to answer that question as we look through this passage. So I encourage you to keep your Bibles open, keep your handouts open if you've got the passage there, and we'll work our way through. Now this is a pretty typical story structure in the Bible. We see kind of within the trilogy of the story, there's almost three sort of parts to this story as well. We see that Jesus, he arrives to a situation, he then responds to the situation, and then he shares teaching after the situation. And this happens all throughout the Bible. We see something happen, Jesus respond, and then he teaches those who are willing to listen. And you'll see that in your outlines there. I've got some headings to say that there's the situation at the bottom of the mountain. We'll look at that. We see Jesus' response, and then we see the lesson from the story that we look at today. So let's jump in to Luke chapter 9 at verse 37. What's the situation that we see as Jesus comes down the mountain? Remember last week he was on top of the mountain in all his glory. Last week he brought three disciples, Peter, John and James, with him up the mountain. And in the first verse of our passage, we see the next day he comes down from the mountain and there's a large crowd that's gathered there to meet him. Why is the large crowd there? Well, this is a story that is also told in Matthew and Mark as well. And in Mark's account, we find out that the disciples, Jesus' disciples, the left, weren't the special three that got to go up the mountain, they're there arguing with some teachers of the law. There's a bit of a commotion going on. And there's this stir in the crowd. And then Jesus hears from the crowd a man cry out. A man cries out to Jesus in verse 38. And he says, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. A spirit seizes him and he suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions so that he foams at the mouth. It scarcely ever leaves him and is destroying him. I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they couldn't." See, what's the situation that Jesus comes into at the bottom of the mountain? It's a scene of fear and despair. Here, this father is in desperate need of help. There's this evil spirit who's been tormenting his son. And the disciples, they were unable to help. A few weeks ago, Katie and I didn't make it to church one Sunday. We were getting ready for church as a family. Just before we had to leave to church, our lovely little Florence just fell onto the carpet. She bumped the back of her head and she managed to knock herself out. Now, we can almost laugh about it now because she's all right. But in that moment of seeing her unconscious, unresponsive, as she laid in our arms, not knowing what was going to happen, the sense of fear and despair that came over Katie and I, as we looked at our little girl and knew there was nothing we could do to help her. We just had to wait and hope that she was all right. Maybe as parents you felt that, seeing your kid hurt themselves. And that dread that comes over you, you think, I just wish I could help them. But in many ways, the experience Katie and I had is nothing in comparison to this father in this story. See, this father has been experiencing this for years. Again, in Mark's version of this story, Jesus asked him, how long has this been going on? And he says, from when he was very little. This young boy has been tormented, fits, blacking out for years. Could you imagine the father's desperation? Could you imagine the fear that comes over him every time he sees his son go through this? And this is no natural illness or injury that's happening here. No, this is an evil spirit that is tormenting this young boy. Some people have thought, oh, maybe this boy had epilepsy. The symptoms seem to be like that. But clearly, there's a spiritual element here. There is a spiritual evil that is tormenting this young boy. And this father is desperate for help. And you can imagine that maybe he had a sense of hope when he saw the disciples. Remember a few verses earlier at the start of chapter 9, Jesus sends out the disciples. What do? They heal and they drive out demons. This father's probably heard and thought, great, if I just find the disciples, they can fix my problem, they can save my boy. Imagine the despair he felt when he brings his boy to these disciples that have done so much good, and they say, sorry, we can't help you. Maybe they tried their best, but for whatever reason, this demon wasn't coming out. And then Jesus comes down into this situation, and the father cries out to him, Teacher, I beg you, please help me. Please help me, Jesus. How is Jesus going to respond? I think at first when we read this story, he doesn't respond the way we think he would. At first, it seems a bit odd the way he responds, and it can at first hearing sound a bit unloving. Jesus, he turns, and the first thing he says is, you unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Sounds like Jesus is fed up. And at first, it can sound like he's fed up with the Father. It sounds like he's speaking to the Father because the Father speaks to him. But importantly, as we look at other passages in Mark and Matthew, we see that Jesus actually has an intimate conversation with the Father. He engages with the Father. In this sense, he's directing his rebuke, in a way, to the crowd that's there, to his disciples. He turns to the crowd and says, you unbelieving and perverse generation. Now this, in many ways, should make us think of Exodus. Last week, Graham helpfully pointed out that mountaintop experience of the transfiguration of Jesus has a lot of echoes of Exodus in it, right? God speaking, the cloud descending, Moses being there, Elijah. Moses and Elijah were the two people in the Old Testament that went up on Mount Sinai to meet with God. There's all these echoes of Exodus. And if you know the story of Exodus, as Moses came down the mountain, what did he find at the bottom? Did he find the people faithfully following him, trusting in God? No. What did he find? Well, he found an unbelieving and perverse generation. A group of people that stopped trusting in God, started trusting in themselves and building idols for themselves. It seems not much has changed here for the people of God. Jesus goes away for a little time on the mountain with a few people to be revealed in his glory, and as he comes back down, he finds people in a mess. He finds disciples scrambling. He finds an unbelieving and perverse generation, and he's frustrated and he's angry at that. He's not frustrated and angry at the Father, hear that. He's frustrated and angry at the crowds that are there, the teachers of the law who are debating with their disciples while this Father is suffering. So Jesus turns to the Father and he says, bring your son here. And it says, even while the boy was coming, the demon threw him to the ground in a convulsion. There's almost this last-ditch effort from this demon to cause as much harm and evil as he can. But Jesus, calmly and straightforwardly, he rebukes the impure spirit. He heals the boy, and he gives him back to his father. Can you see that even in the midst of unbelief, even in the midst of evil and chaos, Jesus brings restoration and healing to this family? And unsurprisingly, this amazes the crowd that's standing there, right? In verse 43, we read that they were all there and they were amazed at the greatness of God. The crowd is amazed at what has taken place. But then as we move on in the story, we see that Jesus, he teaches a lesson to his disciples, to those closest to him. And did you notice, there's a bit of an interesting thing there to pick up, that in verse 43, who are the crowds amazed at? The greatness of God, isn't it? It's God's greatness that they are amazed at. But then as we continue the story, as Jesus shares with his disciples, what does Luke say? While everyone was marveling at all that Jesus did. You notice that? Just spoiler alert if you haven't read the whole story. Jesus is God. As they marvel at what God has done, they're marveling at what Jesus has done, because he's just been transfigured and revealed as God himself. Right? God is there. God is the one acting through Jesus. And Jesus turns to his disciples in verse 44 and he says, listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. I really like the way the ESV translates this. It's quite literal. Literally it is, let these words sink into your ears. Really listen. Kind of like Lil when she got up here. Listen, you need to hear this, guys, right? Listen. This is important, Jesus says. And what does he say? Well, we read it there. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. Again, Jesus speaks to his disciples about his death, his suffering, what's about to happen when he goes to Jerusalem. The disciples, maybe they were listening, but they didn't really understand what was happening, did they? It says in verse 45 that they did not understand what this meant. It was hidden from them. So they did not grasp it, and they were afraid to ask him about it. Have you wondered, why were they afraid to ask Jesus about this? It obviously seems really important to Jesus, right? Why not ask him? Maybe they were embarrassed, they weren't picking up what Jesus was putting down here. Or maybe they feared the answer to their question. Jesus wouldn't really die, would he? The Jesus who has power over death and evil. I just don't want to go there. So the disciples, they've still got a lot of learning to do as they journey with Jesus. And this is made even more clear by what happens next. They break out into an argument about who's the greatest, right? We used to play this as kids, like who's better, I'm better than you because of this, who's the king of the castle. That's the kind of thing going on here. And it's a bit ironic because in the midst of Jesus teaching them about his suffering, his humility, that he's going to be handed over to men to suffer and die, all the disciples can worry about is themselves. All they can worry about is their status. These disciples have got a lot to learn. And this might all seem a bit childish to us. We live in a culture that's very much tall poppy syndrome. You don't try to stand out. But in Jewish culture, status was everything. It mattered who you sat next to at the table. It mattered who the people you hung out with, who they were, what their status was. It mattered what rabbi you followed and how much that improved your status. Status was everything to them. But Jesus, he takes this moment to give them an object lesson. Look at verse 47 there. Jesus, he knows their thoughts. So he takes a little child and had him stand beside him. And then he says, whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For it is the one who is least among you who is the greatest. See, Jesus flips the disciples' thinking on its head. Into a discussion about who is the greatest, he brings a child. Now, it's important to note here that Jesus isn't saying there's something inherently great about children that we should all aspire to be. For those youth kids in here, sorry. Any of us who are parents know that kids don't have that much inherent goodness. They have some. Sometimes people think, oh, they're so innocent and pure. They're not really. Even our little Florence is only 1 year old and she's really working on her argumentative side. She's been defiant, a bit rebellious, and she's only 1, right? No, Jesus isn't saying, oh, be like this pure, innocent child. Instead, he's saying, if you want to be great in my kingdom, you need to hang around with those who the world thinks is lowly. You need to hang around with people who have no inherent greatness to themselves. True greatness comes in humility in Jesus' kingdom. And that makes sense, right? Because who's standing in front of these disciples? Is it not God himself who has humbly come down to be with them? Because Jesus then says, if they do this, if they welcome the lowly, well, they welcome God himself. They welcome Jesus and they welcome the one who sent Jesus. See, this is the way God wants his kingdom to be. Greatness in God's kingdom is not about status. It's not about who you hang out with. Well, it is about who you hang out with in some ways, but who you hang out with who are lowly, who are rejected. But unsurprisingly, as we're coming to see in this story, is the disciples have still got a lot to learn. Just after Jesus teaches them about how they must welcome the lowly, welcome people in, what does John say? Well, John pipes up, and again, it's a bit ironic what he says. He says, Master, well, we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he isn't one of us. Like, Jesus has just taught them about how they should welcome in the lowly, and the first thing the disciples say is, but there was someone over there and we shouldn't let them in, Jesus. Jesus and his disciples, John and the rest, they're worried about keeping some sort of special status, right? They're the disciples. There's this other person who's preaching Jesus, and he's not part of us. He's not in the inner circle. Right? John was on the real inner circle. But Jesus isn't trying to make an exclusive club here. And he replies to John, don't stop him, for whoever is not against you is for you. Right? Jesus' circle is not an inner circle, it's the whole world. And then our passage ends in verse 50. Here we have Jesus who heals, brings restoration, teaches his disciples about what true greatness looks like, what true humility looks like. And we have the disciples who have clearly got a lot to learn. So what do we as disciples, what do we as followers of Jesus take from a passage like this today? Why has Luke chosen to end the origin story of who Jesus is in this way? Not up on a mountain in glory, where Jesus is revealed to be God himself, but down the mountain in the mess of evil, unbelief, bickering disciples. Well, I just want to finish today with a couple of reflections on this passage. The first thing I want us to reflect on in this passage is the disciples' complete and utter incompetency. Did you notice how incompetent the disciples are in this story? Well, the disciples, they can't drive out the demon that this father needs help with. They don't understand Jesus' teaching about his death. They still don't get it. They're caught up in bickering about who's the greatest while Jesus is trying to teach them about his suffering and humility. And they still are looking to exclude other people from joining in on the party because they're worried about losing their privileged position. The disciples, not just in this story, throughout the whole Bible, are pretty incompetent. They're really not cut out for this. Have you ever wondered, it was the disciples that wrote the Bible. Why did they paint such a bad picture of themselves? If I was writing the Bible, I definitely wouldn't include bits like this. See, what's Luke getting at here? Is he just trying to stitch up his mates? No, I think we, as disciples of Jesus today, in passages like this, I think we find validation for the way that we feel deep down most of the time. Have you ever felt a little bit incompetent? I have. Sometimes I feel it when I'm standing up here. Especially since Dave has been around. Gee, I've felt incompetent at times. I mean, who leaves me and Marty and Em and Leland in charge of this church? God's church. What is he thinking? But really deep down, I think if we all consider ourselves, we all know that we're not really cut out for this. It's great to have Matt here and Mel, but Matt's not really cut out for this. You can still vote for him, like that's fine. I'm not saying don't vote for him. I mean, even Dave, I'm not just saying this because he's away at the moment. Sorry, Dave, because you'll watch this video, but even Dave isn't really cut out for this. But none of us are. Just like the disciples in this story, just like the disciples throughout the whole Bible, we have got a lot to learn. We are students much more before we become teachers. But here's the encouragement of this story. Our incompetency does not in any way inhibit God's ability. Our incompetency does not inhibit God's ability to act. See, the disciples, they lacked faith. They lacked prayer. In Matthew and Mark's accounts, they come to Jesus and say, why couldn't we do it? And he says, you didn't have enough faith, you didn't pray enough. But that lack of faith, that lack of prayer doesn't hinder in some way Jesus' ability to heal the man's son. Some people will read those passages and say, well, then we just need more faith and we just need to pray better and then we'll see healings. But that misses the point. What are faith and prayer? Are they not dependence on God and not ourselves? See, our incompetence does not hinder God's ability to act. God does not need us. That might not sound very comforting, but it's deeply comforting. God does not need you, but he wants you. He wants you to follow him. He wants you to trust in him. He wants you to not trust in yourself because you're incompetent. I'm incompetent. I'm not cut out for this. But God is able, even when we're incompetent. Because the second thing I want us to reflect on today is how truly great Jesus is. My goodness, he's good. In this passage, Jesus displays his greatness in the way that he welcomes the lowly. Jesus himself came down to a broken world. In many ways, the picture of him coming down the mountain is the picture of him coming down to earth into our brokenness, into the evil that we exist in, and into a place where there's a lack of faith, a lack of belief, a lack of competency. And yet he still brings restoration and peace. He's still able to act. Jesus' disciples were in no way the cream of the crop back in Jesus' day. They were a bit more like the dregs at the bottom of the bottle, right? But Jesus welcomes this motley bunch of disciples to follow him, to learn from him. It's okay that they haven't got it all. It's okay they haven't worked it all out. It's okay that they make mistakes. Jesus has got it. He's competent where we are not. Jesus welcomed that lot of motley disciples. And he welcomes this lot as well. I don't know if you think you're really great. The reality is today is we're not that great. We're not really cut out for this. But Jesus doesn't call us, he doesn't call his disciples into competency, to do things for him. No, he calls us to trust him and to obey him. We are called to live in faith, with faith in Jesus and not in ourselves. Faith in the one who actually laid down his life and died for those who were incompetent and couldn't do it and couldn't save themselves. I want to invite the musos up because we're going to close by singing a song tonight. You should all know this one. It's Amazing Grace. This song never gets old. I love singing this song. And I love the story of John Newton. And I love this quote that I just wanted to share with you. Right at the end of his life of John Newton, he was a wonderfully humble man who came to understand God's grace in a wonderful way. And this is a quote that comes from him right at the end of his life. He says, "Although my memory is fading, I remember two things very clearly. I am a great sinner, and Christ is a great Saviour." So the good news today is, in many ways, we're incompetent. The good news today is, in many ways, that God doesn't need us, but he uses us. He loves us. He wants us to follow him and learn from him, just as these disciples still had a lot to learn. Gee, we've all still got a lot to learn. But let's stand as a bunch of incompetent disciples this afternoon and let's sing these words. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Let's sing this together, church.